I taught a young man who planned a school shooting for the night of his prom. He had weapons and apparently fully intended to harm his classmates, but was arrested after he made some alarming comments. He seemed like a nice kid, but very strange and withdrawn. He used to try to make jokes and witty comments, but was just awkward and got shut down a lot. Honestly, he was exactly what you imagine a kid who has been bullied but still tries to make friends would be like. I suspect he was on the spectrum as well, but never diagnosed. I feel bad for him despite the terrible things he planned to do. His classmates ended up raising a sizable amount of money and donating it to mental health charities. And they did eventually have their prom just before the end of the school year. The student served about 6 months in prison jail and was given a few years of probation. One of my former students murdered 2 people, apparently on a drug deal gone wrong. He is now serving life in prison. I had him in 1st grade. Sweet kid. Highly intelligent. Seriously. He was reading on a 3rd grade level, despite the fact that he came in late every day. Not just 10 or 15 minutes late. Usually he would come in around 10 o'clock. Dad was not in the picture, in prison for gang activity, and mom was unconcerned about his education. I tried everything I could to impress on her just how intelligent her son was and how he had a very bright future but that he needed to be in school. She honestly didn't seem to care. He later dropped out when he was in high school, joined a gang, and things snowballed. Such a goddamned waste. Edit to at, I'm uncomfortable giving my state but this did not happen in Virginia, Ohio, or Washington. Had an 8th grader who was a jerk. Wouldn't listen. Constantly disrupted the class. And put in little to no effort. Was a bully to the other students. Unfortunately, our admin at the time was a pushover so nothing ever happened when we would refer him or anyone else. One day he came back from the office and I overheard him telling a classmate when asked what happened that the principal gave him some candy and sent him back to class. Cut to 6 years later. See his face on the news being arrested for a gang murder. Not the least bit surprised. The principal probably didn't want to end up in the headlines either. Then the principal shouldn't have that job. That is the principal's job. Doling out discipline. I volunteered a couple of times at an alternative school. One of my pastors was the principal there, so our church youth group would help out from time to time. I was in a 4th grade classroom and was tasked with helping a boy learn to read. It was basic stuff. Cat, dog, rat, etc. He had a task to spell cat and dog, and couldn't or wouldn't try to see the difference. He said he'd never need to know how to read. So why should he? I told him I'd draw some pictures of what the words were next to the words so he could try to memorize them. He said something along the lines of, "If you try to make me do this I'll slit your throat and duck your corpse." Note. I was a 275-pound dude. I told the teacher, who told me not to worry, that they check him daily to make sure he's not carrying a knife since he's had a few incidents. Not sure what happened to that kid. Nothing good. She'd also previously told me he wasn't allowed pencils or pens and was only allowed to write with crayons due to his violent outbursts. If he's still alive he'd be around 25 now. Coincidentally, I mean that literally. I'm not being glib, I didn't end up volunteering there again. I did drive past there once and saw a bunch of kids beating the crap out of one kid outside. I called 911 and was thanked for the report. And that police were already on site. Edit. Changed to pound due to questions. I was a school teacher for 15 years. I have taught 2 murderers and a pedophile. One young girl. She killed another student at a party. Her life ruined in one stupid moment. I think though she is most likely out now but don't know where she is. At school she didn't listen. Bad attitude. Her dad is a gang member so she was raised to be ruthless. 2. He was a cheeky but nice boy. If you treated him well he would give you the same respect but how you ducked with him, that was it. Very low tolerance, did not manage his anger well. He was always very courteous to me so it was sad to hear he killed an elderly man after the old man yelled at him. So senseless. He never really had a chance. His older brother in jail for murder as well. Peter was such a shock. Very popular boy at school. Insanely talented. Never had an issue with him. So really shocked he went to jail for this. I taught at an alternative school for a year. I have several students who later ended up in jail for everything from robbery to murder. Most of them weren't surprising. These were kids who clearly had no family structure or discipline at home. And almost all of them were affiliated with gangs somehow. We even had middle school kids jumped into gangs at the school. But alternative schools get almost no support from anyone but the police. It's basically a step away from jail. The one who committed murder held a pizza delivery driver over a drug deal. He was actually somewhat surprising because he was far from the worst kid I dealt with. He was a skinny, nerdy looking kid with braces. But he was hanging out with all the hard gang members too. I dunno. Maybe he felt like he had to prove himself. Grade 6. A small boy who talked tough and ran a mini gang of bigger boys. Poor student. The only thing he did well was athletics. Amazing runner, but wasn't allowed on the teams because his marks were so bad. His mother looked about my age and I was an undergraduate student teacher. I got that through word of mouth. I never met her because she'd cancel at the last minute any parent-teacher meetings. There were a lot of requests for these meetings. No father figure in his life. Free-range kid in the worst sense. Couldn't respect anyone more than 2 years older than him unless they were black or willing to throw down with him right there. He knew how to manipulate people. He definitely manipulated me. About 10 years later I found out in the news he dropped out of high school to de-gang things. And was part of an interview study on rehabilitating kids like him. I don't buy any of it because it's the same stuff he told me. Also in the news article was that he shot some people in a condo and was later killed in a police shootout. Another one. But he was an instant criminal. A new boy was placed in my class. He had a twin sister in another class and he was very bright. But super quiet. He kept to himself and didn't interact with other students. On a Friday afternoon before the end of the day he sexually assaulted a younger girl in the school toilets. This younger girl looked just like his twin. It was ducked up. The school covered up the whole incident to avoid negative publicity and protect both kids' identities. I am not sure if charges were pressed and was only made aware of it because I happened to be on site and near another senior staffer when she took the call and freaked out. I received a phone call the next day telling me not to discuss it. I don't know what happened to the boy or whether it was the first time such an incident had occurred. The student he assaulted moved interstate. But then eventually returned to school where she struggled with the incident, although it was literally never mentioned after the day it happened. I only remember this because I have been rereading an old diary and I wrote about it there. I've taught 4 students who have been involved with murders. 3 killed one guy together and the 4th shot a person at a hotel party and killed them. I worked at an alternative school so they had behavioral issues. Only one of them struggled academically. They were all class clowns. The one thing that sticks out is that all of them struggled to fit in. They felt like they had something to prove. The 3 kids came in the day after they committed the murder. You could tell something was off. They left early and later we heard what happened. The whole situation is still really clear in my mind. Ducked up stuff. When I was a student teacher I taught the younger of the Boston Bomber brothers. To be honest I barely remember him. When the news broke I had to go back and check old spreadsheets in my laptop to make sure it was actually him. He was only a freshman at the time. I would say he was a little quiet but nothing out of the ordinary. The crazy this about the Tsarneev brothers, especially the younger one. Toka, I think that's how it's spelled, the outpouring of friends after the fact that were utterly shocked. He had these friends at his university who were like, what the hell? He'd never do this. It was as if he was completely normal 6 months. Or even less. Prior to the bombing. Whatever changed him. Changed him quick. My first teaching position I was given a student and told he's a psychopath. We are trying to make a case for his removal. Alternative school did nothing. Please tell us every little thing he does so we can show that his right to education is making this school dangerous for everyone else. I was a 24-year-old girl in a secluded drama room with him, who at 15 was taller and stronger than me. Not fun. I don't know where he is now and don't really want to know. Since then I've only taught small kids who are only just getting old enough to get into real trouble, the eldest being about 14 now. My wife and I are both teachers, but she had the more heartbreaking one with one student. This one boy struggled a lot. Class clown. Occasionally obstinate but got it together to graduate with my wife's help. He was going to go be an apprentice and make some money at the shipyards and take care of his mama. There was a drive-by notorious road in our city. One person was killed. There was other revenge tales associated with that, but the harshest part was the cousin of the victim, our student in question, went and robbed a convenience store and was held by the owner. He had left a note that he was going to do this to try to pay for a funeral for his cousin. Local media portrayed it as a thug got what was coming to him. I leave that call to you. One of our students just got arrested for murder. The murder happened in the evening after school one day. He came back to school the next day like nothing happened. The arrest happened a few weeks later. Honestly, most of the time they are sweet and studious in school. Many of our kids just have hard lives where getting into drugs and gang shit isn't really an option. They keep a very stark separation between their school life with us and their at-home survival mode life. Edit. Wording was confusing. He came back after the murder, not the arrest OBV. I've had two students in my 10-year career that scared the crap out of me. The first was during my student teaching. To say he had dead eyes is an understatement. He told the class repeatedly, which I reported over and over to administration, that he hurts stray animals. I don't know what became of that kid, but I want to stay as far away from him as possible. The other was during my second year of teaching. He was the biggest asshole I've ever known. He was racist against anyone dark, but he was as Black Dominican as I've ever seen. He would bully and harass people, usually girls and usually sexually, in the hall, for anyone to see. It was always stopped and reported. He was a liar and a cheat, and did not understand what was wrong with it if he got ahead. His idea was that life had dealt him so shitty a hand, that his behavior was a product of society than of his own free will. Literally, the most grotesque person imaginable. He is currently serving 25 to life in prison for murder. Couldn't say I was surprised when I heard. As a substitute teacher, I subbed several classes with a student who would later be responsible for murder. He was certainly an obnoxious character, loud and disruptive. I remember subbing him in PE. He was being overtly aggressive in a game of indoor soccer and other students seemed to avoid him. I'm guilty of being slightly happy when he fell and injured his knee. Later I asked him how his knee was and he seemed caught off guard that I even remembered. I subbed the kid he murdered too. He was also a disruptive kid. I actually remember making him sit in the hall because he couldn't stop talking during a test, but other than that he seemed like a nice kid. I even spent some time talking to him. I guess there was some kind of dispute over drugs. The guy beat the other kid to death. I'm not even sure he meant to murder him. He ended up burying him out in the desert and his body was quickly discovered in a shallow grave. Now he's got a life term. From high school to prison. 7 years after I had him in class, a former student was arrested for attempted murder resulting from a botched robbery. Apparently a woman owed my student money for drugs. She was connected to a wealthy family and figured they could steal from them to pay her debt. They incorrectly thought no one would be home at the time of the robbery. When the homeowner threatened to call the cops, my student shot him. Luckily the victim survived, but my student is now serving 20-50 years. It's been about 11 years since I had this kid in class, so I don't really remember many specifics about him other than he really didn't care about school. He and his friends were much bigger than I was and were physically intimidating to me. That class as a whole was probably the worst I've ever had, but I don't think I ever imagined someone committing a crime of this magnitude. Edited for clarity. He told me, in 7th grade. That he'd end up in prison because all the males in his family were in prison. 2 years later, he stabbed his best friend to death over something stupid. So sad that he was made to think he'd never be anything because of his family. I think about him often. I worked in a middle school in a very rough part of town. Several of my students have gone on to be petty criminals. But only one of them was arrested for murder. He was a very well-dressed, outwardly polite and charming kid. He knew exactly what to say to get himself out of trouble. So he often avoided consequences. Rarely did his work. And mom was at her wits' end with him in 8th grade. 2 girls at the school accused him of sexual assault right at the end of the school year. Because it was the end of the year. And he was headed to another school. He got a slap on the wrist. I was deemed harsh and unkind for wanting him to be held accountable. And I was overruled. About 5 years later, he was in jail for the murder of a graduate student in a college in our town. He and another kid attempted to rob the man. And it went awry. I was not at all shocked that it happened. The kid had some serious warning signs at age 14.